Most marriages that fall apart do so loudly. There are slammed doors, raised voices, accusations hurled across long dining tables, like weapons no one knows how to put down. People expect the ending to arrive like a thunderstorm announced, dramatic, impossible to miss. Alisa Moran's marriage ended with something far more devastating than noise. It ended with the soft, deliberate click of a suitcase. No note, no farewell, no confrontation staged at the foot of a grand staircase. Just one small bag, packed with the quiet resolve of a woman who had spent 4 years making herself smaller, so that a man who never truly looked at her could feel bigger. She left behind the Ashford legacy necklace, a strand of diamonds that had always felt more like a leash than a gift resting on the cold surface of her vanity, like a crown returned by someone who had finally decided they were done pretending to be royalty. She took almost nothing. A few dresses, her original sketches, the passport Brandon Moran had long forgotten she possessed. The things a woman takes when she is not leaving for comfort, she is leaving for freedom. He found the bag on a Thursday morning. Brandon Moran, the Duke of Ashford, a man who moved through London's most powerful rooms as though the world had been arranged specifically for his convenience, pushed open the door to his wife's chamber and stopped. Just stopped. Not because he was afraid, not because he was angry, but because somewhere beneath 4 years of managed distance and carefully preserved indifference, something in him finally understood what he was looking at. He was not looking at luggage. He was looking at the consequence of every dinner he had not come home for, every event he had attended with Lady Susan Britt on his periphery, and Alisa invisible at his side. Every morning he had read the financial pages and called that a shared breakfast. Every night he came home in silence and called it a marriage. The question that would take up permanent residence in his mind, the one that had no smooth answer and no prepared defense, was not whether he could stop her. It was whether, in 4 years of standing beside this woman, he had ever once given her a single reason to stay. This is that story. Hey, quick question, how are you feeling right now? Because if this is already pulling at something in you, that means you're exactly where you belong. Thank you, sincerely, for being here. Duke Dom stories exist because of people like you and to keep this world of ours growing. We need your support through subscriptions, likes, and your beautiful comments. So, if this story has already found a home in your heart, please hit that subscribe button, smash that like for us, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We want to know. It matters more than you realize. All right, thank you. Now, let's go back because Alisa Moran's story has only just begun. The estate of Ashford Manor was the kind of home that made visitors stop at the entrance and simply stare. Tall iron gates that opened with the slow authority of something that had never been rushed. Stone pillars draped in ivy, so old it had grown into the architecture itself. A grand staircase visible from the front door, curling upward in a sweep of white marble that caught the light of hundreds of candles every evening. It was, by every standard that mattered to the people who kept such standards, a magnificent home. Alisa Moran had learned, somewhere in the first year of living inside it, that a magnificent home and a warm one are not the same thing at all. She had arrived at Ashford Manor as Alisa Moran, a name she had worn with pride, daughter of a well-respected but modest family, a woman with a sharp eye for design, a genuine laugh, and the particular kind of intelligence that did not announce itself at dinner parties, but made itself known in quieter, more lasting ways. She had left that version of herself somewhere in the second year, not all at once. The way most losses happen gradually, and then completely. By the time the 4th year arrived, Alisa had made peace with her mornings. She rose at 7. She dressed without help because the maid who had once been assigned to her had been quietly reassigned to more pressing household duties, and Alisa had not raised the matter because raising matters had long ago proven to produce nothing but the particular exhaustion of effort with no return. She descended the staircase at 7:30. She sat at the far end of a dining table built for 12, alone, and she had her tea. Brandon was almost never there. When he was, he brought the Financial Times with him like a third party to the meal, something to look at, something to address, something that was more worthy of his morning attention than the woman sitting at the other end of his table. "Good morning," he would say, without looking up. "Good morning," she would answer, with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped expecting the next sentence. There was never a next sentence. Mrs. Natasha, the housekeeper of Ashford Manor, a woman who had served the estate for 11 years and noticed everything with the efficiency of someone paid to anticipate, watched all of this with an expression she kept carefully neutral. She was not paid to have opinions, but she had them. She had them the way a doctor has opinions about a patient who refuses treatment quietly, helplessly, and with increasing urgency. She noticed the morning in late September when Alisa sat at the breakfast table and simply did not reach for the food. She just sat there, hands in her lap, eyes on the window, watching the autumn light settle over the grounds of an estate that bore her married name and felt nothing like hers. "Your Grace," Mrs. Natasha said, approaching quietly. "Shall I bring something warm?" Alisa turned from the window, and she smiled. Not the real one. Mrs. Natasha knew the real one by now. This was the other kind, the one Alisa kept for company. "Thank you, Natasha. I'm fine." Mrs. Natasha returned to the kitchen and said nothing to anyone, but she stood at the sink for a long moment, her hands under the running water, her jaw set. She understood what it looked like when a person stopped expecting things. She had seen that kind of quiet in her own mother's face, years ago, in a different house, in a different time. The quiet that settles in not as peace, but as surrender. She did not want to watch it happen again, but she did not know how to stop it. There is a psychological term for what Alisa was living through in those years, though she would not have named it that way at the time. Researchers call it learned helplessness. It was first identified in the 1960s by psychologist Martin Seligman, who observed that when living beings are repeatedly exposed to situations they cannot control or change, they eventually stop trying even when an exit finally becomes available. They have learned, deep in the part of themselves that processes experience and builds expectation, that effort leads nowhere, and so they stop. This is not a weakness. This is the mind protecting itself, the only way it knows how. Alisa had not stopped because she was weak. She had stopped because she had tried quietly, persistently, in all the ways no one would ever see or credit, and nothing had changed. Not the breakfasts, not the evenings, not the way Brandon looked through her at events as though she were an accessory that had come with the estate rather than a woman who had chosen him. She had tried rearranging her schedule to be available when he came home late. He came home later. She had tried expressing an interest in his work, reading the industry reports he left on his desk, asking about the men he met with. He answered in the same polite, abbreviated way he answered questions from his solicitor. She had tried once, sitting beside him on the sofa instead of the chair, placing herself physically close enough that ignoring her would have required deliberate effort. He had looked at her with faint surprise, said, "You look tired. You should rest," and went back to his reading. That was in the second year. After that, she stopped sitting on the sofa, and now it was the fourth year, and she was at the window again, watching the light, and the learned helplessness had given way to something else entirely, something quieter, something final. It had not yet announced itself, not even to her, but it was there, the way a tide is there before the shore even feels the pull already on its way in, already irreversible. The wedding had been everything a wedding was supposed to be. White flowers, a string quartet, a guest list that read like a directory of Old English wealth and older English names. Alisa had worn a gown with a 12-foot train, and she had floated down the aisle on her father's arm, and every person in that chapel had watched her pass with a particular expression people wear when they want to remember something. Brandon had been standing at the altar, tall, composed, handsome in the way of men who have never had to try very hard at anything. His expression, when she reached him, was warm, not ardent, not undone, warm, the way a room is warm when someone has thought to light a fire before the guests arrive. She had not noticed the distinction then. She was 24 years old, and she was marrying a duke, and the flowers were white and abundant, and she had told herself that warmth was enough. That warmth was a beginning. What she had not known, what no one had told her, perhaps because no one thought to, or perhaps because these things are not the kind of knowledge that travels easily between generations, was that warmth without intention fades, that a man who marries because it is time to marry Because the family expects it, and the season demands it, and the woman standing in front of him is, objectively, a fine choice. That man does not become a husband simply because a ceremony has been performed. Commitment is not a feeling. It is a practice. Behavioral scientists and marriage researchers, people like Dr. John Gottman, who spent decades studying couples, have written extensively about this. They found that the quality of a marriage is not determined by the presence of love at the start. It is determined by what both people choose to do every single ordinary day that follows. The small gestures, the bids for connection, the choice, made again and again, to turn toward each other rather than away. Brandon Moran had never made that choice. Not because he was cruel. He was not. Not because he did not respect her. He did. In the distant, transactional way one respects a colleague. But because no one had ever shown him what it looked like to turn toward someone. His own parents had shared a name, a fortune, and a cavernous house in the country, and almost nothing else. Marriage, in his understanding, was a structure you maintained, not a garden you tended. Alisa had not known any of this on the day she said her vows. She had seen the red flags in the months before the wedding. She had simply chosen to call them something else. The first one had been Lady Susan Britt. Lady Susan was everything that society used as a shorthand for desirable. She was striking, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with a way of entering a room that made other women straighten their posture without quite knowing why. She had a history with Brandon. That much was plain to anyone with functional eyes, and a passing familiarity with London's social season. The way she said his name, Brandon, the single-syllable landing with the ease of long practice, of a woman who had said it many times in rooms that Alisa would never know about. Alisa had noticed. She had asked once gently, "Lady Susan seems to know you rather well." "We grew up in the same circles," Brandon had said, without looking up from his letters. "She is an old acquaintance. There's nothing to concern yourself with." Old acquaintance. Alisa had accepted that. She was 24 years old, and she wanted to believe him. And she had learned early that wanting to believe someone and having reason to are two different things. But the heart makes its own negotiations. The second red flag had been quieter, more personal. In the weeks before the wedding, she had brought him a sketch. She had been an artist since childhood, filling notebooks with architectural drawings and fashion designs and portraits of people she found interesting. She had brought him one of her best, a detailed pencil rendering of the Ashford Manor garden as she imagined it could look, redesigned, more open, less formal, a place where people might actually want to sit. He had looked at it. He had said, "Very nice." He had set it on the edge of his desk and gone back to what he was doing. The sketch was still on the edge of that desk 4 years later. No one had moved it. She had stopped showing him her work after that. She had stopped many things, in increments so small that she could not point to any single moment and name it the breaking point. That was the cruelest part. There was no one dramatic door slam she could look back at and say there. That is where it ended. It ended in 100 small silences, in 1,000 mornings of fine, thank you, and I'm not hungry, and don't wait up. In the steady accumulation of unremarkable moments that, taken together, added up to a marriage that existed on paper and nowhere else. The researchers call this cumulative microneglect. The death of a relationship not by catastrophe, but by consistent, quiet inattention, like a plant no one waters, not destroyed, simply left to make do with whatever light it can find on its own. Alisa had found her light elsewhere. She had taken up her sketches again privately, in the evenings, at the small writing desk in her bedroom that overlooked the garden. She had begun corresponding with a woman in New York, a gallery curator named Jordan, who had seen one of Alisa's pieces at a charity auction and sent a letter that began, "I don't know who you are, but I would very much like to." Alisa had written back the same night, and somewhere in that correspondence, in the careful back and forth of two women who had never met and had no reason to trust each other and decided anyway, something in Alisa had begun, slowly and without her full permission, to wake up. Lady Susan Britt did not consider herself a villain. This was, perhaps, the most dangerous thing about her. She had told herself the story of Brandon Moran and herself many times over the years, in the elegant privacy of her own mind, and in that story she was always simply a woman who had loved first and been set aside for practical reasons. The Moran girl had a better name for the optics. A more manageable family. Nothing personal. Simply the kind of calculation men like Brandon made when it was time to make them. Susan had not stepped away. She had simply remained. She appeared at every event where Brandon was likely to appear. She sat at tables near him. She found reasons to address him directly. A question about the estate. A shared acquaintance who needed mentioning. A piece of information she was certain he'd want to know. She performed the friendship with the precision of someone who had studied the role for years and no longer needed the script. What made Susan truly formidable was not beauty, though she had it. It was patience. She had the patience of someone who genuinely believed that time was working for her. And Brandon, to his lasting and profound failure, had never once given her reason to believe otherwise. He did not pursue her. He was not that careless. But he also did not close the door. Every time Susan appeared at his elbow at a gala, he greeted her with the same warmth he withheld from his wife at breakfast. Every time she laughed at something he said, he stood a little taller. Every time she whispered something sharp and clever in his ear in the middle of a dull reception, the corner of his mouth moved in the way Alisa had not made it move in years. Alisa saw all of it. She saw it because she was right there, 3 feet away, in her navy and silver, the Ashford colors she had adopted on their marriage as a small gesture of belonging, doing the thing she had mastered by the 3rd year, being present without being noticed. She was not a jealous woman. That distinction matters. What she felt watching Brandon and Susan together was not jealousy. Jealousy requires believing you have something to lose. What Alisa felt was more honest than that, and more devastating. She felt invisible. The kind of invisible that doesn't come from being unseen, it comes from being seen and dismissed. From being present in the same room as your own husband and understanding, without a single word being exchanged, that you do not register. The night that changed the shape of everything was the Pemberton dinner. Late November. The house was too warm and the conversation was too loud, and Alisa was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine she had not touched, listening to Lord Richard's wife, a woman named Margaret, whose hobby was the observation and dissection of other people's lives, hold court in the way she always did, leaning in with the practiced intimacy of someone about to share something kind that is not kind at all. "It really is a shame," Margaret said, her voice pitched at exactly the volume designed to carry, without looking like it was trying to. "The Duchess of Ashford is the sort of woman any man ought to treasure. And Lord knows our Duke has never received that particular piece of wisdom." The small circle of women around her made the sounds women make when they agree with something they would never say directly. Small murmurs, small tilts of the head, eyes that slid just briefly toward the fireplace, where Alisa stood. Alisa kept her face entirely still. This was a skill she had developed with some care. The art of hearing yourself discussed as though you are not in the room, and providing no evidence that you are. She set down her untouched wine. She crossed the room with the kind of grace that comes not from training, but from a spine that has decided, once and for all, it will not curve. She found a young man from the estate, the son of one of their tenant farmers, there with his employer, and she spent the next 40 minutes in genuine conversation about agricultural reform and access to rural education. And she did not look toward the corner of the room where Brandon stood with Susan once. Brandon, across the room, looked at her 3 times. Each time, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Something uneasy. The look of a man who has always assumed the furniture is where he left it and has just noticed an empty space where something used to be. He did not know what to do with the feeling, so he did nothing, which was, of course, what he always did. But Alisa, driving home alone that night with her hands folded in her lap, and the dark road unspooling outside the carriage window, made a small, final note inside herself. She noted that she had stopped caring whether he looked, and she noted that this, at last, was a kind of freedom. It was a Tuesday in early February when Alisa Moran did the smallest, most radical thing she had done in 4 years of marriage. She put on a red dress, not the navy, not silver, not any of the colors she had quietly folded herself into since the wedding, the palette of a house she lived in but did not own, colors chosen not for what suited her, but for what fit the aesthetic of a legacy she had married into and never been fully invited to share. Red, warm and unambiguous, the color of someone who has decided, at last, to take up space. She came down the staircase that morning at her usual time. Mrs. Natasha, who was crossing the entrance hall with a stack of linens, looked up and went entirely still for half a second and then, very quietly, in a way that required careful attention to catch, she smiled. Brandon was, for once, still at breakfast when Alisa arrived. He looked up from his paper. He looked at the dress. He said nothing. Alisa sat down, poured her tea, and began to eat. "You're wearing red," Brandon said eventually. "I am," Alisa agreed. A pause. "It's not our colors." "No," she said pleasantly. "It's mine." Brandon did not respond to that. He folded his newspaper with the slightly too deliberate motion of a man who has been caught off balance and does not wish to show it. He excused himself from the table. Alisa watched him go. And then she finished her breakfast. All of it. With appetite. Something had shifted in her, fully and finally. The night before, though, it had been building for months, for years. For every morning, she had woken up and remade herself into something acceptable and left the real version of herself folded under the bed, like an old sketch no one had asked to see. She had been up until 2 in the morning, at her small writing desk, with a letter from Jordan spread open beside her. Jordan had written with news. A gallery space in New York's Chelsea neighborhood had become available. A 6-month pop-up exhibition. The theme, Jordan had written, was reclamation work by artists who found their voice after silence. She wanted to know if Alisa had pieces ready. Alisa had sat with that letter for a long time, and then she had pulled out a clean sheet of paper and begun making 2 lists, side by side. On the left, what she had given to this marriage, year by year, in patience and accommodation and the steady compression of herself. On the right, what the marriage had returned. She filled the left column over 3 pages. The right column had 4 lines. She sat with the paper until the candle burned low, and then she folded it, put it in the drawer, and made a decision. What Alisa had been doing for 4 years is what economists call the sunk cost fallacy, the deeply human tendency to continue investing in something that is not working, not because it shows signs of improving, but because of what has already been put in. We stay in jobs that drain us because we've already given them years. We stay in relationships that diminish us because we've already loved and waited and tried. We confuse the investment of the past with evidence of a future. But the past does not owe you a return. What you've already spent is spent. The only question that matters is, what do you want to do now? Alisa had finally started asking that question, and the answer had arrived wearing red. Over the following weeks, she moved with a new kind of purpose. She began spending her evenings not grieving the marriage, but building what came next. She had, over 4 years, quietly redirected portions of her household allowance with Brandon's full awareness. Though he had never once asked how it was used into a literacy program she had established for the children of estate workers. 32 children, ages 6 to 14, who attended 3 days a week in the East Drawing Room she had long since converted for the purpose. None of them called her Your Grace. They called her Miss Alisa, and she had never once corrected them. She also carried a secret that she intended to leave behind. The Ashford legacy necklace, the centerpiece of the Duke's family jewel collection. A diamond piece insured for £3 million was not, and had not been for 18 months, the original. 2 years prior, when the estate's local hospital had faced the closure of its children's ward due to a funding shortfall that Brandon had been informed of and declined to address, Alisa had sold the real diamonds and had the piece replicated in high-grade crystal by a craftsman sworn to discretion. The hospital stayed open. The ward survived. 11 children received surgeries that year that might otherwise have been deferred. She had left Brandon glass, just as, for 4 years, he had given her a glass life. She had never told him. She planned to leave without telling him. Let him figure it out. The Founders' Gala was held every year on the 2nd Friday of March, an evening organized by the Ashford estate in honor of the original Duke, who had founded the county's agricultural trust 200 years prior. It was, in Brandon's world, one of the social obligations that could not be canceled or delegated. Everyone who mattered would be there. Everyone who mattered would be watching. Alisa had attended every year of their marriage as a silent accessory, arriving on Brandon's arm, smiling at the appropriate moments, making conversation with the wives and sisters of men Brandon actually wished to speak to, and departing with the same collected dignity she brought to every room she entered and was subsequently ignored in. This year, she had decided, would be different, not because she planned to make a scene. Alisa Moran had never been a woman who made scenes. Scenes were for people who needed witnesses. This year would be different because it was the last time. She had booked a train for the following morning, a first-class ticket to London, and from London, a connecting flight to New York. Jordan had confirmed the gallery space. The apartment above it was available for 6 months. Alisa had paid the first deposit from her personal account, the account Brandon did not know about, because no one asks a woman they consider a fixture where she keeps her savings. Her bag was already packed and sitting in the center of her bedroom floor. One bag, small enough to carry alone, containing only what she had come with and what she had made since. The night of the gala, she came downstairs in a gown the color of deep burgundy, not the Ashford colors, not compromise, not performance. Her hair was pinned simply, the way she had worn it as a girl before she had learned to arrange herself for an audience. She wore no diamonds. She wore a small gold chain, with a pendant that had belonged to her mother. Brandon was waiting in the entrance hall. He looked up when she descended, and he looked at her. Truly looked. Not the courteous, functional glance he distributed to rooms full of people. Something different. Something that moved behind his eyes for a fraction of a second before his control reasserted itself. "You look," he started. "Thank you," she said, before he could finish. Not because she didn't want to hear it, because she had waited 4 years to hear something like it, and she had finally arrived at the place where it was too late to matter. At the gala, something extraordinary happened. Alisa was extraordinary, not in the way she had performed extraordinarily in the early years, the careful, curated version, designed to reflect well on Brandon and the estate. This was something else. She moved through the room with the ease of a woman who has nothing to prove and everything to offer. She held conversations that people did not want to end. She made a dry remark about the flower arrangements that made 3 separate clusters of guests laugh out loud, real laughter, the kind that doesn't check itself before it escapes. She spent 20 minutes in deep conversation with Sir George and Lady and Whitmore about the economic impact of rural education programs, and Lady Whitmore pulled her husband's sleeve afterward and said, "Now that is a woman who has been extraordinarily underestimated." Brandon watched all of this. He watched from across the room, where he was stationed with his usual set of associates, and he felt something he did not have a name for because he had not felt it in years long enough to forget what it was. He felt the specific discomfort of a man who is watching someone flourish and understanding, for the first time, that their flourishing has nothing to do with him. Lady Susan appeared at his elbow at 9:15, in her usual fashion, silk that rustled and diamonds that caught the light in the way of things designed specifically to catch light. "Your Duchess seems to be in unusual form tonight," Susan remarked, with particular inflection that attaches itself to compliments designed to unsettle. Brandon did not answer her. Susan blinked. This was new. "Brandon, excuse me," he said quietly. He crossed the room. He found Alisa mid-conversation with Lady Whitmore. He actually waited, with the patience of a man who has not practiced patience and finds it uncomfortable until the conversation reached a natural pause. "May I have a moment?" he asked Alisa. She looked at him with eyes that were utterly calm. "Of course," she said. They stepped into a quiet alcove near the library entrance. The noise of the gala continued beyond the doorway. In that small, still space, Brandon looked at his wife and really looked and opened his mouth. And what came out was, "You seem different tonight." Alisa held his gaze for a moment. Then she said gently, without heat, without bitterness because she was past both, "I'm not different, Brandon. I'm just no longer trying to be less." He stared at her, and she gave him a small, genuine smile, the real one, the one Mrs. Natasha knew, and excused herself, and went back to the room, where she finished the evening being exactly who she was. Brandon stood in the alcove alone for several minutes. He did not know, standing there, that he had just received the last honest thing she would ever offer him. He did not know that when he arrived home that night to a quiet house, she would already be in her room, reviewing her train ticket by lamplight, with the bag zipped and ready by the door. He did not know any of it. That was always his problem. Brandon Moran had not become a man of impulse. His entire adult life had been organized around the deliberate, the scheduled, the managed, which is why, when he found himself at Alisa's bedroom door at 7 in the morning, an hour at which he had not voluntarily sought out his wife in 4 years, he could not have told anyone precisely what had brought him there, except that he could not sleep, and that something about the gala had lodged itself in him and would not dislodge. The image of her in that alcove, the calm in her face, the particular quality of her smile, the one she had given him before walking away, the one that had looked, uncomfortably, like goodbye. He raised his hand to knock. He stopped. He turned the handle instead. The room was tidy, not the usual, slightly lived-in tidiness of an occupied space, the tidiness of a surface that had been deliberately cleared. The vanity was bare. No glass bottles, no silver brush, no folded handkerchief beside the mirror. The wardrobe door was slightly open, and through the gap he could see that the section where her everyday dresses hung was lighter than it should have been. And in the center of the room, on the floor, was a bag. He saw it the way you see things that contradict your understanding of how the world is ordered, with a lag between the image arriving and the meaning following after. Then the meaning arrived. The bag was not large. That was what made it worse. Not the grand luggage of someone staging a departure for effect. One small, leather travel bag, packed precisely, clasped shut. The bag of a woman who has planned, quietly, over a very long time, and is now simply executing the plan. He crossed the room. He lowered himself to one knee beside it, without quite deciding to. His hand found the clasp. He should not have opened it. He knew that. But his hand had moved before the thought completed itself. Inside, a gray dress he did not recognize, though he realized with a jolt that he should. It was the one she had worn the first autumn of their marriage, to a dinner he had been 40 minutes late for and had not apologized for. A small book, its spine worn soft with handling, the title faded. A folded letter addressed in her handwriting to a woman named Jordan, sealed, not yet sent, and wrapped in a square of plain linen at the very bottom. A single dried flower, white, the kind that had been arranged in abundance at their wedding. She had kept one. Through 4 years of cold dinners and empty chairs, and a husband who had failed her in every way that required no grand gesture and only consistent, ordinary attention, she had kept one white flower from the day she married him. Brandon sat back on his heels. He sat there on the floor of her room with the dried flower in his hand for a long time, long enough that the light through the windows changed, long enough that the house began to move around him, footsteps in the corridor, the distant sound of the kitchen starting its morning, and he did not move, because something had cracked open in him that he did not have language for, could not manage or file, or set aside the way he set aside every inconvenient feeling that arose in his life. He had managed grief before, loss before, the cold competence of a man trained to handle difficulty without being altered by it, but he had never stood knelt in a room that should have been full of a person and understood with absolute, unsparing clarity that the emptiness was something he had built himself, one day at a time, with every breakfast behind a newspaper, and every evening that arrived without a conversation, and every moment he had stood next to his wife at a social event and looked past her at someone whose approval cost him nothing, because he had never truly offered her anything either. He found Mrs. Natasha in the corridor outside the east wing. She was standing with her hands folded in front of her, her expression entirely still, in the manner of a woman who had been expecting this conversation and had already decided what she would and would not say. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked. His voice was composed. His eyes were not. Mrs. Natasha looked at him for a moment that stretched past what was appropriate for staff and employer. Then she said, "Her Grace has gone out." "Where?" She did not say. A pause. Brandon studied the housekeeper's face. He had always considered Mrs. Natasha as reliable, efficient, thorough, and loyal to the house. He understood now, looking at the absolute steadiness in her eyes, that her loyalty had never been to the house. It had been to the person inside it who had actually made it a home. "How long have you known?" he asked. Mrs. Natasha's expression did not change. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" "How long have you known she was leaving?" The housekeeper let a very measured silence pass. Then she said quietly, "I noticed a bag some time ago." Brandon absorbed this. "You didn't tell me." "No," Mrs. Natasha agreed, and she did not apologize for it. He left the corridor without another word. He moved through the house with the controlled urgency of a man who has finally decided to do something and is hoping it is not yet too late, though the part of him that reads situations accurately was already quietly suggesting that it might be. He reached the station at 9:43. The London train departed at 9:45. He saw her on the platform. She was standing with her single bag, and her back very straight, and her face turned toward the track. Her burgundy coat, her simple hair, the gold chain at her throat that was not diamonds and had never been meant to impress anyone. "Alisa." She turned. There was no shock in her face, no triumph, no anger, just the quiet recognition of a woman who had known, somewhere deep in herself, that he would come, and had decided it would not change the destination. "Brandon," she said. He crossed the platform. He stopped in front of her. And this was the moment that would live in him for the rest of what followed, because standing there, with the train behind her and the morning light catching the gold at her throat, he could see with devastating clarity what she actually was. Who she actually was. Not the fixture, not the wallpaper, not the Duchess of Ashford. Alisa, the woman he had been given the extraordinary privilege of building a life with, and had spent 4 years treating like a standing arrangement. "Don't go," he said. Just that. No eloquence. No prepared defense. The 2 words of a man who has lost the right to more. Alisa looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I spent 4 years hoping you'd say something like that. I'm sorry it took this for you to get there. Truly." But Brandon, and her voice was not unkind, which was somehow the hardest thing of all. A door that only opens when someone is already leaving is not actually an open door. The train arrived. She picked up her bag. She did not look back. Brandon stood on the platform until the train disappeared around the bend, and then he stood there a while longer, with the dried flower still in his jacket pocket and the wind coming off the track, and learned at significant personal cost what it feels like to understand something too late. The news that the Duchess of Ashford had departed reached society with the speed that gossip always reaches its intended audience immediately, from all directions, and with a precision that suggested it had been expected. Margaret, Lord Richard's wife, who had made the remark about the bachelor duke and his housekeeper wife at the Pemberton tea the previous autumn, discovered that she had misjudged the room's sympathy spectacularly. When she attempted to draw the departure out as entertainment at a morning gathering the following week, she was met with the particular silence of women who have collectively decided that a joke is no longer amusing. Lady Whitmore looked at Margaret over the rim of her teacup and said, pleasantly, "I find I am less interested in this topic than you might hope, Margaret." And the subject was closed. Margaret learned, somewhat belatedly, that public sympathy is a currency, and she had spent hers on the wrong transaction. The estate workers moved first. When word reached the grounds of Ashford Manor that the Duchess had left, 31 of the 32 parents whose children had attended Alisa's literacy program sent actual written letters, hand-delivered to the manor addressed not to the Duke, but to whatever address the Duchess might be reached at, expressing gratitude, expressing something more than gratitude, the kind of words people write when they want to record that a person mattered to them. The 32nd family sent theirs 3 days later. They had taken longer because they wanted to write it properly. Brandon received the letters, and there was a cost to receiving them that no amount of financial management could offset. The literacy program, now without Alisa to run it, required a replacement coordinator. This required money, organization, and the kind of community trust that takes years to build and minutes to lose. Brandon hired a coordinator within the week, not because anyone required it, because the letters had made it impossible, morally, not to. The hospital board sent a separate communication formal, on letterhead, thanking the Duchess of Ashford for a significant charitable contribution made 18 months prior that had preserved the children's ward. When Brandon inquired about the contribution, he was told it had been made in cash from a private account at the time of an insurance renewal on the family jewel collection. He had the necklace examined. Crystal, flawlessly done. Honestly, the craftsman had been extraordinarily skilled, but crystal nonetheless. He sat in his study for a very long time after receiving that report. And then he did something no one expected. He said nothing publicly. He did not pursue it. He did not attempt to reclaim the value. He commissioned a replacement with the understanding that if anyone ever asked about the necklace, it had been redesigned at the Duchess's direction for reasons that were entirely her own. He could not take back for years of absence. He could at least not take credit for her generosity. Lady Susan Britt, who had spent years positioning herself at the edge of a marriage she believed was dissolving, discovered that the dissolution was not the opening she had imagined. Without Alisa to provide contrast, without the easy dynamic of the indifferent husband and the patient former flame, the situation looked entirely different. It looked, to the people who now watched it clearly, like what it was. At the Harrington Spring reception, when Susan positioned herself beside Brandon in her usual fashion, she found him unresponsive in a way he had never been before. Not cold, not rude, but absent, as though the frequency she had always broadcast on had been permanently changed, and she was transmitting to silence. "She really did get to you," Susan said, unable, in the end, to leave it alone. "She was my wife," Brandon said simply. "I should have let her know that mattered." It was the most he said about it to anyone, ever. Susan attended fewer events after that. The social landscape had shifted in a way that did not favor her particular skill set, and she had enough intelligence to recognize a changed room. Brandon lived, for a long time, in a house that echoed. He did not fill the echoes quickly or with poor choices, which was, perhaps, the first evidence of actual growth. He spent a year making the estate what it should have been while Alisa was in it, investing in the workers' community, attending to the local hospital board, learning, slowly and with real discomfort, that presence is not the same as participation. He wrote to her once, a letter, not a demand, no request for her return, just an acknowledgement of what he had not been, written in the plain language of a man who has finally run out of armor. She did not reply, but she read it 3 times. New York in the spring was something Alisa had not known she needed until she was standing in the middle of it. The gallery in Chelsea was smaller than she had imagined and more beautiful than she had hoped. Long windows, white walls, the kind of space that doesn't compete with what you put in it. Jordan, in person, was exactly as her letters had suggested, sharp and funny, and deeply serious about art in the way of people who understand that beauty is not decorative. It is essential. "These are extraordinary," Jordan said, the first time she spread Alisa's sketches across the large work table in the back room. She said it the way people say true things without emphasis, because emphasis would undercut it. "Thank you," Alisa said, and she meant it differently than she had meant it at the gala, in the alcove, when she had cut Brandon off before he could finish his sentence. She meant it with her whole self this time, with a woman who had found her way back to her own voice, and was only now beginning to understand how far she had let it go. The exhibition opened in May. It sold out in 12 days. The reviews were the kind that art journalists write when they are genuinely surprised, slightly breathless, reaching for language adequate to the experience. One review, in a publication that mattered, said, "Alisa Moran's work is what happens when a person stops translating themselves for an audience and begins speaking their native language. The result is not just beautiful, it is overdue." Alisa read it at the small cafe table she had claimed as her regular spot. A corner window, good light, coffee exactly the way she liked it, brought without her needing to ask, because she had been coming long enough that they remembered. She read the review twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her bag. The man at the next table watched her do this. He had been at the table beside hers for 3 weeks, running now a writer. She had gathered, from the notebooks and the way he looked at things, slightly longer than people usually do. His name was Harrison. "Good news?" he asked, nodding at her bag. "Very good news," she said. "Your work." She looked at him. "How did you know I had work?" He smiled. "You have the face of someone who makes things. I noticed it. I'm a writer and I catalog people." She laughed. "The real one. That's either very flattering or very unsettling," she said. "Probably both," he admitted. They talked for an hour that afternoon, and the next afternoon, and the one after that. Harrison knew her coffee before she ordered it by the end of the second week, not because he was performing attentively, but because he genuinely listened when she spoke and retained what she told him, as though everything she said was worth keeping. It was such a small thing. It was enormous. Alisa did not rush toward what was growing between them. She had learned, at considerable personal cost, the difference between the warmth of being chosen and the warmth of being seen. Harrison was patient in the way of people who are sure, not urgently, not performatively, but with the quiet confidence of a man who has decided where he wants to be and does not feel the need to make noise about it. He came to the gallery opening. He stood in the corner with his coffee and watched people move through her work. And when the last visitor left and Alisa stood in the empty gallery with Jordan, he brought both of them tea from the cafe across the street, without being asked. "He knows your tea order," Jordan said afterward, with the precision of a woman who notices everything and comments selectively. "He does," Alisa said. "Good," said Jordan simply. 2 years after the click of a suitcase clasp, Alisa Moran sat in the garden of her rented Chelsea apartment on a late spring afternoon, with her sketchbook open in her lap, and her second exhibition already confirmed, and the afternoon light doing what afternoon light does in New York in May, arriving sideways in gold. The kind of light that makes whatever it touches look like it has been there always, like it belongs. Harrison was beside her, reading. He looked up occasionally, not to say anything, just to check the way people look at things they're glad are still there. Alisa caught him at it once. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She went back to her sketch, and she smiled. Not the performed one. Not the one she kept for company. The real one. The one she'd almost forgotten she owned. "Hey, before we get to the final words, can I ask you something? How are you feeling right now? Because I genuinely want to know." This story was always meant to be more than entertainment. It was meant to find the people who needed it. If Alisa's journey touched something real in you, if you found yourself in her silence, or in her red dress, or in that moment on the platform, then you are exactly the person this story was made for. Please, do one thing for us before you go. Subscribe to Duke Dom Stories, smash that like button, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. I will read every single one. I want to say hello to you. I want to know just how far our story is going, because this community is built on connection, and you are part of it. Thank you, from the bottom of this storyteller's heart. Now the final words. In the end, Brandon Moran learned the most expensive lesson of his life, and it did not arrive as a headline or a scandal or a public humiliation, though some of those came. It arrived as a dried flower in his jacket pocket, as 32 handwritten letters, as crystals where diamonds used to be, as a woman on a platform who looked at him with eyes full of something he finally recognized as finality, and walked away without looking back. He learned that presence is not the same as showing up, that marriage is not an arrangement to be maintained. It is a person to be chosen, again and again, in the small, ordinary moments that no one ever applauds because no one is watching. He learned that the doors we neglect to close are the ones that let everything out. And Alisa Moran, who spent 4 years being a fixture, a wallpaper, a ghost in a house that bore her name, but not her presence, learned something too. She learned that self-worth is not something another person gives you. It is something you choose to reclaim, quietly, in small acts of red dresses and personal accounts and letters answered at 2 in the morning by lamplight, in the decision to stop investing in a loss and start building toward a life. She learned that it is never, in any meaningful way, too late as long as you are willing to pick up the bag. She learned that the right person knows your coffee order, not your title. May we all have the courage to pack our own bags when the room no longer sees our light. And may we all be wise enough to recognize the open door before we are standing on the wrong side of it, whether we are the one who stayed too long, or the one who should have held the door open from the beginning. Thank you for watching Duke Dom Stories. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. We'll see you in the next world.